We have reached that point of the NBA season. The games aren't starting yet, but Joe, I don't know about you. I can feel the squeakiness on the basketball court of the shoes. I can feel the basketball bouncing, and we are getting close. Media Day is here, and we got the takeaways coming up on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies today. I am one of your hosts, Damichael, joined by my co-host here, Joe Mullinax, here to give you the latest going on with the Grizzlies here on Locked On Grizzlies. We have a jam-packed episode for you today. A lot's going on in Grizzlies Nation. I was out there at Media Days, and we have a lot of takeaways to get into for today, Joe.
Yes, we absolutely do. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. We've missed you, Damichael. I don't know if you've been able to frequent the YouTube comments, but a couple of times it might have been your burner. I can't confirm or deny. But there were people saying, where's Damichael? We missed Damichael. Is Damichael coming back? So some harsh critics of the Solo Joe shows, but that's all right. I'll get better at it as I get rolling. I can say that more than any YouTube commenter, I am glad you're back, Damichael, and hopefully we can continue to get into the routine now that we are in your show every day territory with the Locked On Network. Basketball is back, and you'll be seeing a lot of myself and Damichael moving forward. But as you mentioned, Damichael, you were on the ground. You were there for Media Day, and it was the first time in a couple of years, obviously because of COVID, that people were actually able to physically go in person to the Media Day in this way. It hasn't happened that way in a while. So maybe just start us off with your general impressions being back in front of everyone for the first time in a long time.
My general impressions was, first of all, before we get into those general impressions here, let's first of all thank you, Locked On Grizzlies fans and listeners, for making Locked On Grizzlies one of your first listens each and every day. I appreciate you. Joe, appreciate you. And we're both going to be on these episodes going forward as we get closer to the season. So thank you for listening. And make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we recently, in the last couple months, reached 1,000 subscribers. So as the channel continues to grow, hopefully we get to 2,000 and maybe even 3,000 subscribers by the end of this season. The channel continues to grow. Make sure you're listening each and everywhere. That's Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast. Locked On Grizzlies is there. Now back to Joe's original question, and that is my general impressions from Media Day 2022. And first of all, as you said, Joe, it was just great to be back in the building. I think it was great for the players too. As the players walked in, a lot of guys, you can tell when they don't want to talk, but you got the general feel. A lot of these guys were walking in, hello, looking at faces, seeing some familiar faces, and they got the feel. It just felt like this is just part of the process of getting back to playing basketball and getting back to, just the organizational steps to the NBA season. But, there was a lot to take away. Of course, there were a lot of things that, people were not just super candid on at this point. I know, John Morant gave out a few you'll see teasing type responses. Steven Adams basically said a couple times, ask me that question a little bit closer to the season after we see a couple practices, and I'll get back to you. So you had some of those, but we learned a lot, Joe. And I think where we should start in this episode is the question people have been asking us the most, Joe, and that's about Jaren Jackson Jr. And I think we got positive news on the Jaren Jackson Jr. front first and foremost before we get into everything else. And that is Zach Kleiman started off. He basically said that Jaren Jackson Jr. is progressing really well. He's healthy. Taylor Jenkins came in after that and said that Jaren Jackson Jr. is doing some 1-on-0 basketball things right now. So don't take a lot with that. 1-on-0, that's very light. There's
more than zero basketball players they'll be trying to defend Jaren Jackson Jr. here in a few weeks.
Yeah, he's getting defended by air right now, Joe. So not a lot to take from
Hard
that.
to mess that up.
It's just the fact that he is working on skill development. So you got that update as well. And then there was Jaren himself, who said he feels good. He's still on pace to get back in the 4 to 6 month timeline that was outlined at the beginning of July. And he also added in a little kink in there, Joe. He said, look, if anything, he wants to beat the timeline as far as possible setbacks or anything. So it's either he's going to be on time or he's going to expedite that process a little bit quicker. But all signs on the Jaren Jackson Jr. front look good, Joe.
Ahead of schedule, perhaps, which is promising. And that certainly would change my calculus going forward as we preview the season. This team having Jaren back before December looks a lot different than Jaren having having Jaren back before the All-Star break, right? A lot of what the regular season standing of this team is going to be determined by Jaren Jackson Jr. and his whereabouts. So I know I read your article over in the Commercial Appeal. You did a great job with that, by the way. Shout out to Damichael. And again, as I mentioned on the previous day's episode of Locked On Grizzlies, there's tons of great content creators out there. Damichael's just one of many, one of the best, I will say. I'm a bit biased with my partner here. But there's plenty of other folks to follow, lots of great things. The high tides raise all ships. It really was cool to see so many folks interacting with the content, talking about what was being said. And the Jaren news was almost unanimously positive. I don't think I saw a single person coming out of that saying, oh man, Jaren's not going to play when we think he was going to play. He gave off a very reassuring vibe. And I don't know that that's necessarily always the case, not just with Jaren, but anytime a player is injured, body language can kind of give you away. You know what I mean? Body language, the energy that you have going into a situation, you maybe look like you're not ready to do something, or that the words that you're saying aren't necessarily backed up by what your body is physically capable of doing. I didn't get that vibe from Jaren Jackson Jr. at any point in the stuff that I saw and listened to today in your reporting on the matter. I think that having Jaren in a place where he's mentally good, he's physically progressing, that holds tremendous value, obviously, for the roster. And, of course, long-term, Jaren figures to be in Memphis for a little while. They're going to err on the side of caution, understandably so, but it seemed like he isn't going to be rushed. And even if he is put in a position where he is asked to return early, it's not going to be like rushing along for the sake of rushing. It's going to be, we did such a good job with your rehab, or Jaren in particular did such a good job with his rehab. His body is ready for it faster than we thought it would be.
Yeah. And we talked about it, Joe, when we get to that point, there will be more questions to be asked about his process and his progress. The number one question that I'm looking forward to asking eventually is, when he gets closer to the return period, how are they going to manage him going forward? We also learned that this injury, as speculated, I wrote the story this summer about when I spoke with a doctor, and the doctor told me this had to be something that happened in the offseason based on the timeline of everything in terms of the procedure was done and the 4 to 6 month time frame. It had to be something that happened in the offseason. That was confirmed, where the Grizzlies said that this was an off-site injury that Jaren Jackson Jr. suffered. He immediately reported it back to the team and let them know as well. So, that was credit to him to acting really fast there, so the Grizzlies could, act as well and do what needs to be done to get him back closer to the start of the season. But going back to my point here, when you suffer those stress fracture type injuries, a lot of times they come from usage. We mentioned this is the most games he played in the season. This is coming off a season where he barely played in the previous season. And the year before that, I think he played 50-something games. So
bigger
with that
frame, bigger body.
Exactly. So you factor in all of those factors, Joe. It all comes down to, when he does get back, how are they going to play him? Because you when you have those, back-to-backs, does he play both nights initially, or is there, a ramp-up period sort of as when he's playing games as well? I think that's going to be the next step to monitor once we get to that time period. But the Jaren Jackson Jr. news was huge. And Joe, it has a lot of ripple effects too.
Yeah, it impacts multiple members of the roster that we'll continue to talk about as we grind forward on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I'm not one to bet on futures, Damichael. I don't know if you are or not. I do my best not to. I used to be a gambling man, and I learned firsthand why the casinos are as big as they are, right? But if you're willing to do it responsibly, if you're interested in participating in the fastest rising industry in Tennessee and across the country, by all means, continue to make betonline.net your number one source, not just for basketball betting information, but for football, betting information, as well as the main season swing comes in for football and basketball gets underway. Find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, in-depth articles, and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-minute scores for every sport that is out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including Major League Baseball, the NBA, MMA, boxing, NFL, college football, golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Damichael, you mentioned the ripple effect of Jaren Jackson Jr.'s injury. One of the guys that figures to most directly benefit from that is Santi Aldama. And you mentioned in your article in the Commercial Appeal how it appears the early leader in the clubhouse for that role that you and I have talked about on these airwaves in the past is Santi Aldama. Now, I liked Jake LaRavia. If I remember correctly, you talked a little bit about Santi, but you also weren't against the idea of Dylan Brooks moving to the 4 and Zaire Williams being that 3 or 2, whatever you want to call him in terms of his size. And we'll talk more about that later in the show, I know. But to hear that folks were so high on Santi, usually they're not ever going to admit this to Michael, but you've been around enough teams to know they're going in with like common talking points, right? Like this is very much a controlled environment where they kind of already know who they want to see win that job. I got the vibe that it was Santi Aldama, and you wrote it in your article that he seems to be the early leader. They mentioned experimentation. How much they do that will be something interesting to watch as the preseason plays out. But Aldama being the early leader in the clubhouse, mildly surprising for me. I didn't think that they would, not necessarily write off Brandon Clark, but Aldama is not the finished product that Clark is. Although Aldama is, theoretically speaking, perhaps the one best equipped to do the job while Jaren is out.
Yeah, it was interesting, right? Because, Santi's one of the names that's been thrown out there, but here's why we came to that, conclusion in a way that this guy, it feels like he's the leader. No one outright said, hey, this is Santi's job to lose. But
yeah, but there was still a vibe in the
there
words.
was the vibe, Joe. Yeah. There was the vibe. When Zach Kleiman spoke and he spoke about the potential players, who was the first guy he mentioned? It was Santi. And then Taylor Jenkins asked a similar question as well about the power forward position. The first player he mentions, Santi Aldama. And then other players chime in. And then there was Dylan Brooks who came in, and he was speaking not specifically about the power forward position, but he was just speaking about, players who can take that leap. And he mentioned Zaire Williams, who, let's be serious here, everyone's mentioned Zaire Williams when it's come to the whole leap thing. So that's no surprise.
That's easy work for for podcasters, bloggers, and writers everywhere. Come on, Dylan, pick up the intensity of your hot takes.
Pick up the intensity, Dylan. And he did, Joe, because unprovoked, he said, I'm going to tell you guys something. Santi Aldama, he said, that's a player who's going to really surprise you this season. And he said 100%. That's the guy he's expecting to surprise. And I thought it was noteworthy that Dylan Brooks, of all players, said that. If you follow, our coverage, and I'm sure Joe can tell you, just like I can tell you, Dylan Brooks is one of the most honest, straightforward guys when it comes to speaking to the media. So when he says Santi Aldama is someone who's going to surprise you, I think you should believe it, because if someone's not playing good, Dylan Brooks is the one player that's going to say he ain't playing good right now. Dylan Brooks isn't going to talk around it, and he'll let it be known. When I think my first dose of this when I joined the beat was when Zaire Williams kind of broke out in January, and everyone was, oh, wow. So he's really playing good now after the bad start. And Dylan Brooks was like, we got to work on him with sliding his feet on defense. and that's when I knew this is an honest man right here. But with Santi, you have a lot of the key ingredients. I asked Taylor Jenkins because I wanted to get a feel, because they're not going to straight up say who is the favorite right now. So I wanted to get a feel, right? I asked him, okay, what are the ingredients you're looking for? He mentioned chemistry. Of course, that's what every coach says. Chemistry is very important. Then he got into the Grizzlies formula. He said defensive versatility. is number one above everything. Santi Aldama, we saw him in Summer League. Okay, it was Summer League, yes, but we saw it in doses in, with the hustle and with the Grizzlies as well. He was a guy in the Summer League. I believe he had a 7-block game, kind of set a Summer League record. And a lot of that was in switches against guards and things like that. He showed some defensive versatility in the Summer League. Then they mentioned shooting. We've seen Santi Aldama be capable of shooting the three-point shot. Then they mentioned playmaking. Haven't seen a lot of playmaking out of him yet, but he's put the ball on the floor, which, could lead to playmaking opportunities. And I think in this Grizzlies offense, he won't be asked to playmake, a lot anyway. I don't think even Jaren Jackson Jr. was, as high of a rate as a guy like Kyle Anderson did. But anyways, he kind of feels like the most equipped when you talk about chemistry, playmaking, shooting, and defensive versatility all in one. And when I say most equipped, Brandon Clark is, I think, the most talented player. But what they're looking for, I think, is they want to keep Brandon Clark in that role where you bring him off the bench as that six-man, the guy who plays with Tyus Jones, and they both, combine to make the bench unit really good. I think that's why they're favoring Santi. But Joe, I know you have your guys you like. So just what were your thoughts on all of that?
I wasn't as married to wanting one guy over the other as perhaps others were. I think that the malleability of the roster allows for you to flirt with the idea of a Dylan Brooks in that spot or a Xavier Tillman, all sorts of different ways that you can go in terms of trying to replicate what Jaren brings to the fold. But I do think Aldama provides the Grizzlies experience within the scheme. He allows for them to continue their development track. Jake LaRavia being the starter would make the most sense in terms of development. David Roddy is not the shooter that LaRavia is, but Roddy in theory is that playmaker, both off the dribble and as a passer. From the college game, at least, he showed some of that in his game, I believe, from Colorado State where he was. Mm-hmm. So you have some pieces that are young that could do it. But again, Aldama has played a full professional season. He's played some NBA games. He single-handedly destroyed the psyche of the Phoenix Suns with that massive dunk that he had off the dribble. So all kidding aside, I think that Aldama, he may not be my first choice because I'm not a huge believer in what he's going to be able to do in the long term. But in fairness to the Grizzlies, he makes the most sense in terms of, okay, instead of theoretically saying he's not a good fit long-term or he may be a questionable fit, now we're going to be able to, I hate to use this phrase, collect data on what Aldama looks like in that role, and you're giving him an opportunity to showcase whether or not he can sink or swim alongside Morant and Bane and Adams and Brooks. If you're not able to be your best self among those guys who are likely, at least two of them for sure, and Morant and Bane, to be the core of this roster, you may not be longed for the Memphis Grizzlies. And I do believe that this is going to be an important stretch of play for Aldama, whether he earns the starting spot or even in the more recent sense, if he doesn't earn the starting spot and now you're looking at a rookie beating him out, that brings his role on the roster even more into question.
Yeah, that's a great point. If a rookie who he's a late first round pick, a rookie late first round, mid to late first round pick would likely be, the case to beating him out. That would definitely be saying something in that situation, especially you look at the situation where Santi was, given a lot of toolage last season, and he was put in a situation this year where he's put in a situation to succeed. The Grizzlies kind of gave him a lot of opportunities in Summer League. And there were a couple of times where I said, okay, he's had a really good game. They're going to shut Santi down. And they kept throwing him out there.
They wanted to see more.
That was
the vibe I got.
Yeah, the consistency. You wanted it to be consistent. And I think he was one of the better players on the team, especially in Las Vegas out there in the Summer League. So even in this fourth position, you won't need someone who necessarily has to do too much, because once you factor in Josh scoring, Dez is scoring, Dylan Brooks, what he mentioned a lot today when he was talking at media days, Dylan Brooks talked a lot about shooting efficiency. He said it a couple times. He didn't talk a lot about it, but the words efficiency came out of Dylan Brooks's mouth. I know, Joe. It came out of his mouth enough It came out of his
The
mouth.
hold on. The word efficiency came out of the mouth of Dillon Brooks in terms of shooting.
There is a
basketball.
Shooting a bat. There is a consciousness there. You know,
not like shooting your shot on Instagram in the DMs with the models. We're talking shooting your shot on the basketball floor.
We're not talking about no other type of shooting, but shooting a basketball through the nets at the FedEx Forum.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, he mentioned shooting efficiency a couple times. So with Dillon Brooks saying that, now there were times I thought, hey, he just thinks those are good shots. I mean, you got to live with it. But there is a consciousness there in Dillon Brooks to be more efficient. Now, whether that will lead to more efficiency or not is a whole completely different conversation.
Fingers crossed.
But the fact that you have three guys in Ja, Dez, and Dillon who are very capable of scoring, then you have Steven Adams cleaning up on the glass. Santi won't be required, if he is the guy, to score, 15, 18 points per game. Right. There is a role that'll be played there. And, of course, we know at the end of the day, Brandon Clark will get a lot of those minutes regardless if he's coming off the bench or starting. And then the Grizzlies did mention a lot of guys. Among the guys that were mentioned, Joe, we talked about Brandon Clark, Santi Aldama, Xavier Tillman was another name that was thrown out there, but check these names out. David Roddy, Jake LaRavia, Zaire Williams, Dillon Brooks as a potential small ball forward. So a lot of options to play around with, Joe.
They have the ability to mix it up wherever they see fit. And I do think that is going to be something that's going to make this preseason much more interesting than perhaps it would be if Jaren was healthy. When we come back on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, we have a couple of more tidbits to dive into from Media Day, an extension that was perhaps given away, a new candidate for randomly still growing, even though they're NBA players. Some final thoughts on Media Day when we come back on Locked On Grizzlies. Damichael, we talked about Santi Aldama being the early leader in the clubhouse for that starting four position with Jaren Jackson Jr. out to start the season. Another one of those candidates, Brandon Clark, he might have fumbled the bag a little bit, but not literally, like in a figurative sense. He might have fumbled the bag. He may have given away the fact that he's about to announce, or the Grizzlies are about to announce, a contract extension. I know you were there on the ground in Memphis. It makes a lot of sense. Clark has been seen as a core piece of this team for the last few years here. He's been there just as long as John Morant has from that 2019 draft. Your takeaway on if you took that slip up as a slip up, are people overanalyzing Clark, basically saying he's so excited to sign this contract? I want to paraphrase him. I don't have it directly in front of me, but I know I read that he said something that made it sound like it might be a done deal, but when it's not quite there yet, perhaps.
Yeah, he did say something of that sort, like, I'm so excited to sign this. He didn't say contract. He just signed this, and then he kept talking. But he kept reiterating, the things that I feel like, the players are, told to say, and they're just made aware to say in a way that, hey, contract discussions are out of their hands. And, he just kept reiterating that he's happy to be here. He's happy to be in Memphis. And I think that's usually, the hint from guys when they say, look, it's out of our hands. We want a deal to be done. You go back to John Morant. We talked to him in May at the exit interviews. He didn't straight up say, I'm signing on the dotted line, but he basically said, I'm happy to be here. He kept reiterating he is happy to be in Memphis.
Right.
So with that being said, the chances are now, I think, Joe, after talking with him, look much stronger of that extension possibly happening, before the start of the season here, before, we reach the deadline for players in his class to sign those extensions. And now we have to get into, what that will look like for him, what it will look like for Memphis going forward. And I think now the chances are definitely stronger, Joe.
And it made a lot of sense for Kleiman to address that, as well as the Dillon Brooks extension possibilities. Steven Adams even getting some shout out and possible extension love. All three of them were deemed important parts of the Grizzlies franchise. What that actually means in terms of dollars and cents bears watching. I'm going to tell you something that doesn't make a lot of sense to Michael. And I'm going to move forward a little bit on this one, because this is a very important topic. every year, the last few years, some member of the Memphis Grizzlies has inexplicably grown. Like, just physically continued to develop. They're so young still. I think we forget that. I know I forget that. Like, they're still so young that like Jaren Jackson Jr. was still physically growing the last 2 years. And now it seems like somebody who has taken that mantle, according to, Twitter and listening to the media days and reading your work over at the Commercial Appeal, is Zaire Williams might be a 6'10" shooting guard. What is the validity of this? Because I know the water in Memphis is delicious. We can all agree that it's just fantastic. But there must be something in the water to help these dudes continue to grow, because a 6'10" shooting guard would be pretty valuable, I'd imagine, if that is indeed the case.
It's definitely some of the best water in the world.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Shout out to the Memphis tap water.
Shout out to the Memphis tap water. And Zaire's definitely had some of that water as well, because when I watched him very closely walking into the room, because this is the first time I've heard this. Right. So when he was walking in, watched him very closely, still, very slim frame, which kind of stood out to me, being that one of the things they say he wanted to work on was, putting on weight. So I said, it must have been really hard, But then I was like, did he get taller? Maybe he did put on weight. He just got a little bit he got a little bit taller. So when he got up there, he got asked about it. And he said, literally, all the players on the team, players have all come up to him. Did you get taller? Did you get taller? He personally said, he hadn't measured himself and noticed it or anything, but so many people have said it to him that he feels like it's got to be true. And I tell you what, Zaire Williams was already listed at 6'9", and if you've seen him up close, it's not a cheap 6'9" either. This isn't he's 6'7.5". Let's boost him up a couple inches because he has
some lifts inside the Nikes.
Yeah, he is every bit, of that. So if he's probably 6'9.5" now, maybe, or something. But if he gets up to 6'10", he already shoots. He has a higher shooting release. He loves the mid-range shot. We see the three-point set shot is a high shot as well. Could be scary hours. That inch makes a big difference when we're talking about NBA shooting. And look at a guy like Kevin Durant. How he shoots effortlessly over the top of defenses and things like that, and gets the shots he wants. And a guy like Kawhi Leonard, who is 6'7", but he has these super long arms and palms, to where when he fully extends to shoot the basketball, you ain't blocking it, Joe. So I think the Grizzlies have something in this guy, if he's really truly grown, and I want to see it on defense too. Let's see some chase down blocks, right? Let's see some closeout blocks and some steals and deflections in the passing lanes. You want to see this newfound hype come to fruition, Joe.
And you want to see that lateral quickness that Dylan Brooks was so hard on young Zaire about in his rookie campaign. Not quite that hard. But I do think that Zaire Williams, we'll talk about him throughout the lead up to the season. We'll talk about him throughout the season, I'm sure. So much of his development will dictate how successful these Grizzlies are this season. They've put a lot of eggs in that basket. They put a lot of eggs in the John Conchar basket, who I know we'll be talking more about in subsequent episodes. He and Zaire are just really important to what this team is going to do. And you either believe in that completely, you have your doubts, or maybe you're a little bit in the middle in terms of wanting to see it play out. And the first chance we get to see it play out, or at least some folks like Damichael get to see it play out, is in practices leading up to that first preseason game here over the next week. I got to tell you, folks, thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every single day. Tomorrow's show, we'll keep talking about the fallout from training camp. John Conchar has earned some interesting focus in terms of how he expects his efficiency to align with a increased role. So Damichael and I will talk about that and some other lineups perhaps that we're excited about entering into training camp. Make sure that after you make Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day, you make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball, where Josh Lloyd, I've been very fortunate to be on his show in the past. He's fantastic. He hosts the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It is free, and it is available wherever you get podcasts. So you're checking out Locked On Grizzlies now. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Fantasy Basketball coming up next. For my wonderful co-host Damichael, I'm Joe Mullinax. Thanks for checking out Locked On Grizzlies. Thanks for chatting it up with us here about Grizzlies training camp. Onward and upward, all the more to talk about as the preseason gets underway. Thanks for checking out Locked On Grizzlies. Until next